Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mike Mason, and I'm going to be talking to you for about the next 40 to 45 minutes or so about applying human factors to being a dive leader. A lot of people think human factors is just about safety, but it's so much more than that. If you can really embrace all the concepts and make them work for you, then it will make your diving better, more rewarding, and definitely more enjoyable as well. My background is in military aviation. I've been doing that for about 22 years now. I also work part-time as a dive master over here in Australia, which is where I live now. And so I think those kind of things combined allows me to have on offer quite a good perspective to the wider diving community, certainly people that lead dives, with regard to how they can apply human factors. So the scope of this presentation, my aim is to help you guys realize that as dive leaders or people leading dives, certainly, there are an awful lot of ways you can embrace human factors. It's all about making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And I'll come on to that phrase quite a lot as we go. I'll talk a bit more detail about my background, which will hopefully show you about why human factors is so important to me and why I'm such a believer in it as a concept. Start with the why. As simply as possible, I'm just going to condense it down and show you why I think all this is so important. I'll talk about the bow tie model, which again I'll reference several times during the presentation, which is quite a simple pictorial way of how to prevent things going wrong, and then if things do go wrong, how you can mitigate them to stop things getting any worse. Human factors as an area is absolutely massive. What I'm going to do today is just pick on a few areas in the time we've got available that I think are particularly relevant for dive leaders, that are quite important and prevalent within the dive leadering community. I'm going to use some stories and some case studies as we go to help get the message across. I've got a few bits of specific guidance towards the end that you can actually put into to action to make things work, and then I'll summarize and take questions at the end. Okay, me. My background, military aviation for over 20 years, about 22 years now in total, mostly in the Royal Air Force on the front line flying fighters. I was also an instructor in the RAF and quite an experienced supervisor by the time I left. I now work for the Royal Australian Air Force, teaching their young pilots to fly the Hawk jet trainer. I also hold a commercial pilot's license, which I got in the UK before I left. On the right-hand side of the screen there, in terms of diving, I learned to dive in the Caribbean back in the late 90s. That was all through BSAC. I had quite a long break, but I got back into it about 7 years ago for various reasons and never really looked back since. I've now got about 300 dives in my logbook from all over the world, as far north as Iceland. That top picture is in Iceland there, and then as far south as New Zealand. I'm a BSAC qualified dive leader. I'm also a PADI qualified dive master, and I work out here for a local dive shop. I'm taking people on guided dives. I'm a rebreather diver as well. I try and do that as much as I can. There's a picture there of me with my my fiance on my rebreather, and I'm working towards getting my trimix qualification for that. I came across the Human Diver organization a few years ago. If people haven't heard of that, then you can Google the Human Diver. They've got a good Facebook group, and they're all about bringing human factors into the world of diving from other sort of industries. And since I came across them, I thought this is all really good stuff. But the more I learn about it, the more things I realize actually just how much more there is out there to learn. I now instruct for the Human Diver. I'm about to start a webinar series starting in about a month's time teaching for them. And it's all about just spreading the knowledge and trying to help people get safer at diving and get better at diving as well. That's what the Human Diver is. Right, start with the why. Why does all this matter? Why do I think that dive leaders should be thinking about human factors? Dive leaders, it's the clues in the title. They are leading people on dives. They're taking people on dives who are often more experienced themselves, and so by nature they're kind of responsible for keeping people safe and also making sure they have a good time. Now, a definition of human factors, which I already alluded to, is it's about making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. If you overlay the dive leader description or job description onto this, then it's all about making it easier for dive leaders and their divers to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And that's the main concept I'm trying to get across today, and why I think it's really important to think about human factors as people that are dive leaders or leading dives. What's the problem? Now, fortunately, diving's pretty safe generally, statistically. Most of the diving that we'll do, certainly as sort of dive leaders or leading inexperienced divers, is generally quite shallow, recreational level diving. But it does come with its own set of challenges, and you are going to get the occasional injury or, tragically death while under the supervision of dive leaders. When accidents and incidents do happen, it tends to be several little things that come together to result in something big going wrong. And in isolation, these individual little things wouldn't actually matter. But when they all combine and something goes wrong, it's really easy to look back with hindsight and see how all those things added up. But it obviously wasn't easy at the time, otherwise the accident or incident wouldn't have happened. So for me, the problem with a lot of this stuff is there's lots of potential small problems that happen an awful lot of the time that we can do something about before they combine to become a big problem. Now, a lot of these little problems are actually the conditions that promote human error rather than the errors themselves. And I'll talk more about that as a concept as we go. I'll come back onto that quite a few times. Right, we've done what, or sorry, we've done why, we've done what, let's do how. How can we fix these problems? Now, we can't fix these problems completely. We can try and get rid of as much as we can. There is a lot of things that you can do within that though. And I'll talk about some case studies and some stories throughout to try and draw some of those lessons out there. And I'll also have some of my own ideas and some specific guidance at the end, like I said. Now, beyond the specific ways of fixing stuff, I'm also going to talk about generic kind of non-technical skills that we can use to solve complex problems. Now, non-technical skills, don't compare it with recreational technical diving. It's different to that. It's to do with communication, teamwork, leadership, decision making, those kind of things. And the ultimate aim of any kind of non-technical skills training concept, training program, is to help people who are in a team, in a group, develop a shared mental model much more easily. Now, a shared mental model means that you're all on kind of like the same wavelength, as it were, thinking the same kind of things. You've all got much more of an idea about the goals and what you're trying to achieve. And if you have that shared mental model, it means that you're far more likely as a team to be able to deal with any unforeseen problems if and when they occur. When you go diving, you don't know what's going to go wrong. You're not expecting anything to go wrong, otherwise you wouldn't go diving. But if you've got this good grasp of non-technical skills as a dive leader, then you can be far more effective at getting people to work together straight away and be more of a team than just as a group of individual divers. And that gives you a much higher chance of a successful outcome if things do start to go wrong. Right, let's start with a story. So, dive group, they surface after just under an hour, and they're a lot further away from the boat than they expect. There's a bit more current on the bottom than they predict. So they try and signal the boat from a distance with whistles and DSMBs, but they're unsuccessful, and they eventually just drift out of sight. About 2.5 hours later, they get picked up. They come across an oil platform. Fortunately, they're in that part of the world. They get out, they make a phone call, and they get picked up by the dive shop boat, and everyone lives to tell the tale. Brilliant! It's a happy ending. So let's try and look at this and fit it into the what and the how from the previous slide. So firstly, what were the problems? We'll focus on just three problems for this, or three factors rather, that were involved with the divers drifting out of sight. You had more current than expected. The boat wasn't keeping a sufficient lookout for whatever reason. The boat didn't see the divers for whatever reason, and there were insufficient signaling devices from the actual divers themselves. Now, if you remove just one of those, this would probably never have been an incident. If there's no current, the divers wouldn't have drifted far from the boat. If the lookout on the boat was much more effective, then they would have seen the divers further away. And obviously, if the divers had better signaling devices, then the same thing would have been achieved there. So how do we fix these problems? Well, specific examples, you could have an SMB at the whole dive, so you could be tracked where you are from the surface. You could send up a DSMB early once you've identified there is drift down there. You can make sure that the lookouts on the boat have got good vantage points and are especially active once the diver's surface to surface time has expired. The divers themselves take bigger DSMBs, take beacons, take flares, etc., etc. So those are kind of specific things you can fix. In terms of non-technical skills, so firstly, situational awareness, and the main one here. You've obviously got the divers under the surface being aware of the current and the effects of that, but on the boat, accurately monitoring the time so that they can be especially active once the divers should be on the surface and be looking for where they're coming from. Now, secondly, we've got leadership, another non-technical skill. The clues in the title, as a dive leader, you are supposed to be leading the dive. So make sure that you brief your team on what to probably expect, but also what to possibly expect, and that way you can all be much better prepared. Something that's often talked about with diving is plan the dive, dive the plan. And that's kind of fine in principle, but in reality, dives often don't go quite to plan for various reasons. And so you've got to think about all those what ifs the whole time to achieve or better improve the chances of having a more successful outcome. Now, the knowledge that you try and impart when you're doing this briefing about what to probably and what to possibly expect as the dive leader, that's largely going to come from your own experience, but also what you get from other people. And that reinforces a third non-technical skill, which is communication. And in this case of this group drifting out of sight, it's really important that after things have calmed down and everybody's now back on dry land and can talk about it, that you have an open and thorough debrief after the incident to really try and dig into all those lessons. And then once you've got those lessons, you can spread them far and wide, throughout BSAC via the incident reporting system or DAN or whatever, so that other divers can think, oh, okay, yep, fair enough, and then nobody else has to drift off and, worst case, not find the oil platform and never seen again. By doing all this, it sets people better up in future. And then you can also look at these error-producing conditions that I was talking about. It's really hard to actually change the way we as humans work. You can't just fix human nature because it's just almost impossible. We are shaped by millennia of evolution. But what you can do is fix the conditions that promote human error. And I'll come onto that an awful lot as we go. It's all to do with trying to get rid of the things that allow human error to, or encourage human error to happen in the first place. Right, the bow tie model. So at the center of the model, we have an adverse event. Now in dive leading, that could be getting out of gas, or somebody getting tangled, having an uncontrolled ascent, or drifting out of sight, like we saw in the previous story. Excuse me. On the left-hand side, what we do is we put in all these defenses and barriers, and the idea of those is to drive the probability of that adverse event occurring to zero. So as a dive leader, defenses and barriers are going to be things like just communicating with other dive leaders or other divers about particular dive sites to get all the information you can, having a thorough brief, doing methodical buddy checks with your team, making sure your kit's serviceable, and also knowing how each other's kit works. That might sound a bit obvious, and if everybody dives together all the time, it is. But if you're diving with new people, it's worth just having a quick check. As an example, about this time last year, I was working as a Divemaster on the local dive boat. And one of the customers had an i3 BCD, which has got a little lever down by the kind of left hip that you push. I can't remember which way it is, but one way for inflate, one way for deflate. So it doesn't have the conventional over-the-shoulder hose that we're used to. Now, if we hadn't talked about that and he'd had a problem in the water, I'd have just been like, no idea, mate, don't know how to make you positively buoyant. So it's really important that we sort those things out on the surface before we go. Now, despite all these defenses and barriers we put in place, back to the model, we're never going to drive the probability of an event to zero. Humans are involved. Human error is going to creep in, even if it's a really small amount. So on the right-hand side of the model, we assume that the probability of the event is 1, that it's going to happen. And what we try and do now is fail safely. So that's just to do with reducing the impact of an adverse event. As a dive leader, things like team emergency scenario training, the practical rescue management course that BSAC run, making sure that your medical kit is sufficient, making sure your emergency oxygen is full, making sure you've got accurate next of kin details, testing an emergency response plan. And an example there, which I think came from a BSAC expedition, there was a group went out to Croatia a year or so ago, and one of the team got DCS. And their plan was for that DCS, or for any DCS casualty, to be evacuated from the island by ferry rather than helicopter. But when this happened, they realized the ferry only ran at certain times. So they've now got this casualty stuck, and it's like, what do we do next? And, with COVID, that's an even bigger scenario. Are the nearby chambers even open? So moving on, can you get rid of human error? As we talked about with the bow tie model, you can't really get rid of human error at all. You can try as much as you can. You can reduce it quite a lot, but to actually remove it completely is futile. It can't really be done, especially in diving. But the good news is you can change those conditions that promote human error. So I'll go more into this now. I've talked about it. I've hinted at it a couple of times already. Now, this is a brief all by itself. It's a massive topic, and there's an awful lot of research out there on it, lots of examples. Within the dive leader world, what you want to try and do is look at just specific ways to manage the environment that you're in to try and avoid that human error happening in the first place. Give yourself plenty of time to prepare things. When people need to pay attention, such as when you're doing a dive brief or doing checks or a plan or whatever, then just avoid distractions. Do it in a sterile, quiet environment as best as you can. Keep things as simple as possible so that people don't have to remember too much. There's a huge list out there of all this sort of things, but it all goes back to that original principle of making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And lots of ways you can think about it as we go. Okay, assumptions. This is something that comes up quite a lot in human factors theory type things. Whenever we talk about whenever we talk about assumptions, rather, we talk about the issues with assumptions, and you say to people, right, what's your key takeaway? And they'll be like, right, well, I'm never going to make an assumption again. And the problem is it's impossible, and for good reason. As human beings, this is the reason that we can deal with life as the pace that we do, because we can make assumptions all the time. And I get examples in diving. So when I work as a dive master at my shop, I assume that when the customers arrive, that they speak English. I assume that as they're qualified divers, they can swim. And when we get on the boat and I say to them, have you got all your kit? And I'll reel off a quick list, but I'll say, have you got all your kit? They'll just say, yep, and then we just go. I'm going to assume that they're telling the truth when they've got all their kit. If I was to ask everybody if they spoke English, or if I was to get everybody to prove they could swim, or make sure everybody showed me all their kit before we left, it could come across as patronizing. Arguably, people would find it rude, and it would certainly be time wasting. You'd get funny looks at least. Now, the key with assumptions is knowing when to validate an assumption, when to get more information before making a critical decision. Okay, and a critical decision is one from which there's no turning back. So once that decision's made or that course of action is taken, that's it. You're committed. In diving, a very good example is to do with a negative entry, which is one where you're going to go off a boat and you've got to get through some surface current down as quickly as you can. So you've got no air in your jacket, no air in your BCD, etc., and you're just going to go straight down. Now, when you're doing a negative entry, it's a really good idea to not assume that your gas is turned on, because if your gas is turned off, then you're going to obviously go down, sink. You won't be able to make yourself float. You won't be able to breathe, and a fatality is quite a likely result. So check your SPG. Versus your regs to make sure needle doesn't fluctuate a couple of times before you jump in. Make sure that obviously, as well as your regs working, that your wing inflates. Press the button to make sure it inflates and actually hear gas going in. Same with your suit. Do the same with your buddy and make sure your buddy checks you as well. Really important for a negative entry type example, a classic critical decision. Communications, another area I'm just going to focus on. This quote here from George Bernard Shaw: the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And if you kind of think about that, that happens all the time. My partner and I will constantly just sort of say something and it will just get misconstrued just because of the context or whatever, and we have to kind of have a conversation about it. It happens. It's so common when you kind of think about it. It's almost funny, but can be quite frustrating. Here's a definition of communication: an accurate exchange of information between two parties in a timely manner. Now, for me, communication is that kind of non-technical skill glue that holds it all together. It brings all these things in to help a team function. Everyone's got their own thoughts about what's going on around them, what they're perceiving, how they're dealing with the situation. But if you want to share those ideas and sort of form that effective shared mental model, you need to be able to communicate effectively. It's not easy, but it's certainly something that can be improved the more you think about it, and you can get a lot better at it. Again, it goes back to making it easy to do the right thing, and it helps avoid those conditions that promote human error in the first place. Now, for a dive leader, classic example of communication is in the briefings. And in my experience, most briefings are pretty good, but they often tend to be quite one way, i.e. the dive leader will just go on transmit without actually too much sort of audience dialogue. Not always the case, but often the case, and people just can often switch off there. Communicating during the dive is limited for obvious reasons, but there are a few ways to do it better. And after the dive, something we don't see too often or all the time certainly is debriefings. I certainly found that in my military BSAC club when I lived in Scotland, debriefings were quite prevalent, but I certainly haven't seen it everywhere around the world. And debriefings they're the best way to learn about things that happen on the dive. And it's not just things that went badly, it's also things that went well, so you can reinforce those as good behavior. I'll come on to some specific examples for communications improvement, briefing and during the dive and debriefings a bit later on. Right, Singapore reef dive. This is a story from a lady called Mandy, who I know, who lives in Singapore, and she was diving with a local company that she used to dive with quite regularly. And to put a bit of context behind diving in Singapore, if you don't know, There are relatively few dive sites. They generally consist of quite a shallow reef, and they're quite poor visibility just to all the shipping and quite strong tidal currents that constantly stir up the seabed. With COVID-19 as well, the dive companies out there are struggling a bit. There's fewer divers per trip, 4 down from 8, etc. You've still got all those normal costs of, skipper, filling the tanks, all the other costs of staff, but then you've got additional costs of cleaning and sanitizing, etc., etc. The dive guides on this boat were also encouraged by the company to use leftover air from previous dives to save on filling costs and avoid partial fills as much as possible as well, which all kind of adds up to cause problems. So it's there's a dive master here, a guy called Ray, which I'll talk about. And he'd already been out that morning with another group of divers. And on this second trip out with Mandy, when they're on the boat on the way out, and Ray was kind of sat at the front of the boat, keeping away from the group until just before they got to the dive site. So the boat crew helped the other divers get their kit ready. About a 40-minute boat ride, and just before they get there, Ray rocks up, gives his brief, which is essentially just 2 sentences about the location and the max dive time. And Mandy, she knows the area quite well. She's dived this area quite a lot, and she knows that a lost buddy is quite likely. So she just says to Ray, "What are we going to do if we have a lost buddy?" And Ray kind of rather flippantly says, "Well, yeah, if you want, we could do a lost buddy procedure." But Mandy was like, "Well, you're the dive master. Can you please tell us what you want us to do if we lose our buddy?" And Ray says, "All right, just look around for a minute and then meet on the surface." Okay, fine. So the brief is complete. They get in the water. There's Mandy, there's 2 other divers, and there's Ray. And when they're in the water, Ray just says, "Okay, everyone, just descend where you are around the mooring rope and meet at the bottom." Fine. They go down. There's a little bit of mid-water current. Mandy just gets distracted for a second. She loses sight of the group. Oh, never mind. She goes back up to the surface, but she has to wait for about 5 minutes before Ray eventually appears. And Ray then says, "Well, why didn't you go down the rope?" And Mandy says, "Well, there was no specific mention of going down the rope." So it's like, okay, they now go down the rope together and start their divers with the 4 of them on the bottom of the sea. After about 20 minutes, Mandy sees this torch waggle through the gloom, swims over to it to find Ray hanging off the octopus of one of the other divers. So they abort the dive, meet on the surface, and then discover afterwards that Ray had never actually checked his tank after the first dive and ran out of gas shortly into this dive. So what can we take away from this story? Firstly, the dive leader is the leader. So it's important to engage right at the start and make people want to follow you as the leader. Among other things, ask people if they've got any concerns about the dive. It can help you alleviate their concerns. And also, if you know the concerns are there, then when you get in the water, you can mitigate them if you think it's appropriate. Now, secondly, when you're given the dive brief, if you miss something and somebody points it out, which is all part of teamwork, then just be humble and thank them for helping point it out and make sure you go over all the details. Thirdly, if you lose a diver, then follow the procedure you said you'll follow. So if you said we're going to look around for 1 minute, meet on the surface, then do just that. These procedures exist for a reason, and that sets the example for other people that procedures are meant to be followed. They're not just optional, much as we'd like it. Lastly, as the dive leader, make sure you do your pre-dive checks with a buddy who may well be less experienced than you. And this does 2 things. First of all, it sets the example to novice divers, or junior divers rather, that buddy checks should be done every dive and not just when you're a novice. And it also makes it far more likely that you're going to get in the water with everything set up correctly, and in this case, have more gas. We've talked a few times about changing the conditions that promote human error. So after the dive, it's really important to have a debrief and look at those conditions. In this particular example, COVID was a real factor to do with this environment in Singapore. A lot of dive shops operate under financial restrictions, trying to make ends meet. There's always time pressure, certainly in the commercial environment, in my experience. If dive masters are going to the same site again and again because there's such few options, then repetitive activity, just literally repeating the same thing over and over again, can get quite boring. And all these things add up to make it more likely for dive leaders to make mistakes and cut corners. Have they allowed enough time to do a thorough brief and to make sure everybody's checked their gear properly? If you just are under all these external pressures, you're just going to lose a bit of focus, perhaps, and these things are more likely to fall by the wayside. So if you can look at those conditions right at the start and do what you can to mitigate them, again, you might not be able to get rid of them completely, but if you can get rid of the conditions to a certain extent, then it just makes it more likely to have favorable outcomes. Okay, another story. This one was told from the sort of victim's point of view. I read it a couple of years ago now, and there are certainly some lessons for dive leadership within it. So Dave, the victim, he surfaced from a relatively shallow dive, no deeper than about 20 meters or so, and he quickly started to feel numbness in his extremities. And this started to spread, again, even quicker, and he realized that he had very little time left just to do a few actions to try and save his own life. So he inflated his wing, he put his alternate reg in his mouth, which was on a bungee, and he kept his mask on. Shortly after that, Dave was incapacitated, largely just unable to move, and was just waiting on the surface to be noticed. Now, the dive leader, who was on the boat just nearby, noticed this, dived in to the rescue. Brilliant. Swam over quickly and in textbook fashion, took the reg out of Dave's mouth, took his mask off to check if he was breathing. And Dave was still breathing, which was great. But the dive leader got a bit excited with the adrenaline of the emergency, and he lost focus on the casualty because the captain's shouting at him and he's trying to listen to what the captain's saying. And Dave's head is now going under the surface of the water, and he's starting to get water in his airway, and essentially starting to drown. So that's obviously not good news. But the adrenaline did provide a bit of reprieve because they get him back to the boat, and in their adrenaline fueled rescue, they actually kind of drop Dave face first on the deck, and the water comes out of his airway so he can breathe again. Brilliant. Dave did survive, but he was initially diagnosed as a near drowning victim. The DCS wasn't picked up very quickly because he was largely paralyzed, and that has some quite long lasting consequences. As an aside, so Dave's actions, I think, were pretty good. You know, he's thinking, right, stuff's about to go wrong. I need to make sure I can float and I can breathe. But there's no mention in there of him losing his weights, and it's one of the first skills that we learn, whether it be, you know, PADI open water or ocean diver, etc., etc. But despite the fact that it's one of the first skills we learn, accident statistics are littered with examples of people getting to the surface and then sinking again and then being found dead on the bottom with their weight belt still attached. So as a dive leader, super important to make sure that you know how to get rid of your divers' weight belts in a hurry, but also how they know how to get rid of yours in case you need help as well. It's not just them. One of the most important parts for buddy check. Actual takeaways for this story for dive leaders, it's all about the rescue. So we'll go through our first aid every year, we'll go for our oxygen administration courses, that kind of thing. But the practical rescue management course that BSAC run is really good. And as a direct comparison, you know, like I said, I work for a PADI affiliated dive shop out here, and it's just that kind of thing. Even though we're dive professionals, once you've done your rescue course, there's nothing like practical rescue management in PADI, certainly not in the industry for me, which I think is a bit of a shame. After we came out of our last lockdown in about maybe 4 or 5 months ago, I talked to the manager about having like a day like this, and he was like, yep, sounds good. But it ended up being a bit of a rush. It was barely 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon, and we got some stuff out of it, but it was nowhere near as thorough as a kind of dedicated day like the practical rescue management courses. So it's something that I would encourage you to really get on board with. By doing these kind of end-to-end drills with, you know, different scenarios, you can just practice what to do when things go wrong that you don't expect. This is why pilots do emergency simulators. It's so that if things do happen for real, they're much more likely to be able to deal with the adrenaline and make good decisions. It makes it easier to do the right thing in a real emergency. So I really encourage clubs to do practical rescue management courses if you don't. People can be they'll be thinking and training outside their comfort zones, and if you kind of do the drill like end to end, then you can actually figure out what works and what doesn't. So you can test if your emergency response plan is actually valid. We talked about that Croatia one a while ago. Does everyone know how to use the emergency oxygen? Does everyone know how to use the boat radio? Because you might be the one person who's free just to make an emergency call. How are you going to get a casualty back on the boat? Now, again, we've got all these concepts of how to actually do it, but until you've got a real heavy person in the water and you have to get them back on the boat, you don't necessarily know what's going to work for every situation. So by practicing these things, you can figure that sort of stuff out. Is the nearest chamber open? Like I said, definitely something to consider with COVID, these external agencies. Do these courses, get everyone working in different roles, get them out of their comfort zones. And then once it's all over, make sure you have that thorough debrief so people can put their hands up and talk about stuff that they thought was good, bad, and so on and so forth. And that gets all those lessons around so everyone can learn. This is all part of that, the bow tie model on the right-hand side, you know, mitigating what to do when things have gone wrong. And if you do them like properly and they're well run, they're actually quite good fun as well. Okay, moving on. This story was on Facebook maybe about 3 or 4 months ago by a dive master called Martin, and they'd just come back up after the third dive of the day. back on the surface, and one of the customers just drops their camera over the side. Now, Martin, being a diligent, enthusiastic dive master, decided, right, he's going to chase the camera. He reckons he's got enough air. But the problem was he had to go all the way to the seabed, which was just less than 40 meters that he didn't know at the time. So quite a long way down. This is now effectively his fourth dive of the day. And surprise, surprise, his computer's now telling him he's got a lot of stops to do, which rapidly depleted his remaining gas supply. And he pretty much would have emptied his tank had another staff member not come down to meet him at the 5-meter stop. So the, excuse me. The outcome was good, in that the camera was rescued, but all it took was one or two things to go a bit more wrong in there, and he could have easily had an out of gas scenario and/or DCS, or something worse. Now, this could have been an example of what's called outcome bias, whereby you look at the outcome. In this case, camera was retrieved, and therefore everything before it must have been fine. But actually, to Martin's credit, he definitely tells this as a story of what not to do. Now, the responses, this was on social media. You can predict there were an awful lot of comments on this thread. And most people said they wouldn't go after the camera. The customer should have known better, blah, blah, blah. Now, I personally don't think it'd been that simple, because you've got to consider various things, right? So how expensive was the camera? How deep was the water to start with? If it was a disposable piece of crap and it's 100 meters of water, you'd probably just have a laugh about it and think nothing more of it, because what can you do? But if it's a top of the range Nikon with a really expensive housing, strobes galore, and you've just taken the picture of a lifetime on it, and the water is 10 meters deep, crystal clear, I'd have a go at getting that camera back pretty much straight away. Now, those are quite extreme examples, I appreciate, left and right of arc, but the point is there's an awful lot of gray in the middle, which is really common in diving. You've got to consider, when is the risk of doing something too big? This is a dilemma that dive leaders, dive masters, divers perhaps face all the time. You get to a dive site you've been looking forward to all week. Let's say the weather on the south coast of the UK has just been blown out for ages. It's crap, and you've finally got an opportunity to go dive, but it's pretty marginal. But you know this wreck is going to be awesome. It's going to be covered in fish, and the group's going to have a great time. So you press on anyway. You want to get it done. That's an example of what we call planned continuation bias, where you get really focused on the goal and not sort of worried about what's going on around you with potential serious outcomes. Now, maybe you go and dive this wreck and you have a great dive, but then maybe you do it and somebody gets hurt, and then you look back with hindsight and you see all those little things that added up, and it was obvious with hindsight the conditions weren't fit for diving. Now, dive leaders are exposed to this kind of uncertainty all the time. You don't know what's going to happen. But ultimately, you want to go diving, and you want to go diving with teammates and keep them safe and give them a good time. So if things are looking a bit marginal, it's really worth thinking about and emphasizing the what ifs, what could happen. Think back to the bow tie model. If you've got bad visibility, then it's more likely you're going to get separated. So on the left-hand side of the bow tie model, do what you can in the brief to encourage people to stay closer together than they normally would. You know, look at your buddy more often than you perhaps normally would. On the right-hand side of the bow tie model, make sure that when if they do get split up, everyone knows what to do, such that if that does happen, you can sort the whole problem out much more efficiently. Now, in this particular case of the sorry, there's the bow tie model there as a reminder. In this particular case, if something of the lost camera, if something does go over the side and you're not fixed, you're just drifting around, then what you can do is press the man overboard button on the GPS. It doesn't instantly, send an emergency ping out there. What it does is it just plots a position straight away as a reference, and that allows you options. You can then drift fine. You know where the thing went over the side. You can get somebody ready to do a proper search and recovery option. Okay, so that's just something to think about in this particular example. Right, those are some case studies from real life. Here's a few specific ideas. These slides, they're certainly not exhaustive, but I just want to give some specific practices that can help think about human factors, and hopefully they at least give you some things to think about, and maybe just to develop your own ideas based on your own club diving or your own boats or whatever. So before the dive, what can you do? First one is personal introductions. Now, BSAC, the club environment, people largely know each other, but that arguably makes it a bit harder when you get new people arriving. So it's really important that you try and embrace new people and embrace the concept of what's called psychological safety. Psychological safety is to do with making people feel comfortable putting their hand up and saying, I'm not happy about that. Can you tell me more about this? No, I don't like that. What do that's wrong or whatever. Now, if people don't have psychological safety, they don't speak up, even though they know something's wrong, and all of a sudden things can get a little bit worse. So a really important concept. So when you meet new people, smile at them, maintain eye contact, start a conversation, obviously tell them your name, get their name. If you can, give people a way of remembering your name. We're all pretty crap with names, let's face it. When I go working as a dive master, I wear a baseball cap with my name on it. Name badges are quite useful, perhaps not so relevant in BSAC, but again, something to be aware of. And make sure that people, certainly new, less experienced divers, can come to you as the dive leader with any questions, any concerns that they have. There's no such thing as a stupid question. You're there to help them and make sure they have a good time. Personal example for me, I've been trying for quite a long time to get to New Zealand to do my Trimix course with a guy called Pete Measley, and when he and I were talking about this some 6 or 7 months ago now, he sent me, bounced a few emails back and forth, and one of the emails he sent me just said how much he was looking forward to, getting to know me on the course and teaching me these new things and all this. And I was just a bit like, that just made me feel really good. Just that few sentences for helping sort of build that team bonding was really, really helpful for me. Right, check people's gear, especially if it's their own gear. You want to know how it works. Think back to that story with the I3 BCD at the start. Know where the dump valves are. Know how to get rid of people's weight, how to make them float, BCD, dry suit, etc. It's important to know that people are aware that you're not double checking them. Make sure that everybody's aware that you're doing it for both your benefits. It's so that you can keep each other safe by knowing how each other's kit works. You can do this on the shore or before you leave. If you're going on a boat dive, you can do it on the boat itself if it's a long, stable boat ride. And it's also a good way to help conversations go with people or start conversations, which is all part of that psychological safety as well. Okay, briefs. Like I say, they tend to be relatively one way, not all the time, but a lot of the time. So do what you can to engage your audience. At the start of the brief, has anybody been to this dive site before? If everybody has, there's no point in giving a detailed site description. A good way of making people or getting people to engage in a brief, if you don't know people that well, is to do with hand signals. Gas amounts being a good example. Now for BSAC, let's say someone's got a 70 bar, you might get this, you might get this, you might get whatever. But if you dive with different agencies, SSI I think is an example. If somebody has 120 bar, you might get 120, which to start with you'd be like, what's that? But again, if you talk about it on the surface and have that conversation, it makes it much easier to deal with when you're actually under the water. Also during the brief, as it says here in the note, ask people or tell people that you're going to want feedback at the end of the dive. And that encourages people to make mental notes during the dive if they see things they're not sure about or what weren't clear from the brief, such that they can give you decent feedback at the end. I would encourage people to brief from a checklist. I certainly have a laminated checklist that I take with me every time I go out. The SEEDS brief that BSAC teaches us start, I do actually, I'm a big believer in acronyms. But again, if you get distracted during the brief, when I go out diving here, we often see like dolphins, and it's just like, oh, look, a dolphin. And then it's just a bit like, oh, where was I? Ooh, can't remember. So if you've got a written checklist, it's much easier to get back to that point and make sure you don't miss everything. Set the example. This is going to be a pretty common theme over the next few slides, but be the dive leader that you'd want to follow. So make sure you do your checks with a buddy and make sure people see you doing them. Set that example for the less experienced divers than yourself. Right, during the dive, what can we do during the dive? A classic or a good example is closed loop communications. Now, closed loop communications is to do with repeating things back to confirm understanding. Gas amounts is a good one. So if I ask somebody for the gas amount and they give me 120 bar, I will repeat back 120 and then get a head nod from them to show that I've understood it. It's also a good idea to say that amount 120 bar just bubble it through your reg, because the idea is that if you've got say 10 people, a big number, then by the time you get to person number 10, if you've used your own hand signals back and you set it through your reg, you've got a much better idea of how much gas person one had. It makes it much easier to remember because you're engaging more parts of your brain. All about making it easier to do the right thing. Now, this closed loop communications goes for every hand signal. So whether it's go up or safety stop or whatever, try to encourage people during the brief, not just to give an okay signal back, get them to actually repeat the signal back to you, because you never know, they might have just been looking away for a moment. And if they're going to give you back some kind of signal, it might as well be the signal you've just given them rather than just okay, just to check understanding, make sure that shared mental model is bigger or as big as it can be. Like I say, this is going to be a bit of a theme. Set the example as the dive leader. When you enter the water, do it by the book. If you're doing a giant stride, take a big stride out, look at the horizon, set the example to novices to how the technique should be done. When you're exiting the water, keep your reg in and your mask on until the last minute. Certainly maybe not applicable on a rib, but certainly on a hard boat. There's plenty of stories out there of people getting into trouble on the surface when the waves start hitting them in the face, and they've decided they're going to take their reg off and their mask off, and potentially things are going to get bad quite quickly. And if you do it as the dive leader, people are more likely to mirror what you're doing. They're going to follow your example. Take notes, take wet notes. This serves two purposes. First one, if you see something you aren't happy with, so somebody's trim's a little bit bad, and their fins are digging in some soft corals or something, then you can make a note to talk to them about it afterwards. Or if they've got if their SPG hose is just dangling all over the place, you can talk to them about that, and it will remind you afterwards to talk to them about it. Second example is to do with interesting wildlife, and that could help with people's logbooks afterwards, or just again conversations in the debrief. I often see nudie ranks out here in Australia that I don't recognise, so I'll write those down. And probably the best example recently, maybe about 4 months ago, I was diving with a buddy of mine at one of the local shore diving sites, and about halfway through, he pointed out this fish in a little cubby hole, and I was like, I think that's a frogfish, but I'm not sure. So I wrote down frogfish ? On my slate, and then an hour later when we're out, said, was that a frogfish in that cubby hole? And he said, yeah. And he described to me how in that particular spot of the dive site, which is quite easy to find for various reasons, that you often find these frogfish in these little cubby holes. And that then allows me to be a better dive master and provide a better service to other buddies and customers in the future, because I know what to look for or where to try and find this quite interesting wildlife, which is pretty cool. Right, after the dive, the main point with this is to actually have a debrief. Now, it doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out affair. If the dive was completely uneventful, then it can just be enough to make sure that people are feeling well and they had a good time. Now, during the debrief is when you talk about feedback, though. Ask for feedback. So do all that you can to make people feel comfortable giving you constructive criticism. And that's about really setting the example and admitting your own mistakes, which I'll come on to in a second. If you do get some feedback, then say thank you. Even if you don't agree with it, just say thank you anyway, and then just move on. And at the same time, from your notes that you've made, you can ask other people if they'd like some feedback, and they might just say no, and it's like, okay, fine, move on. But most of us want to get better at diving, so we probably actually would like to receive the feedback. So you can give people advice on how to improve based on what you observed. Now, a little tip here, make the feedback about the behavior rather than about the person. So, for example, let's say a guy called Dave, it'd be like, right, Dave, your fins were constantly in the coral. You need to lift your fins up. That is quite direct towards Dave. But if you say something like, Dave, a horizontal swimming position with your fins kind of up like so is much better for the coral. It's the same concept. It's the same feedback, arguably, but you're making it about the actual technique rather than about Dave, and therefore it's much more likely to avoid confrontation and much more likely to be gratefully received. Again, set the example. So with regard to making people feel comfortable giving you criticism, then if you've done something wrong, no matter how minor, talk about it. You haven't got to make something up, but certainly at the start of a debrief, just start it with, I did this wrong, or I should have done that better. By demonstrating that humility, it shows that you're not perfect, that you can make mistakes, and encourage other people to speak up. I had a dive about 10 months ago, I think early last year. It was a big group, and we were late getting back to the anchor line to get back to the boat. And I'd said at the start that we're going to be on the service with no less than 50 bar and no longer than 60 minutes. But because it took me so long to get back to the line, or to get the group back to the line, we ended up, one of my buddies was down at about sort of 45 bar and about 63, 64 minutes. So not much, but again, I'd broken the standards. So I went and spoke to the chap afterwards, and I said, sorry. I said, this is why it happened, and I reflected on it. And in future, I've now learned that if I have a big group at that dive site and get some stragglers, it's going to take me a long time to get them back to the anchor line. So make sure you go back a bit earlier. Allow more time. Avoid those conditions. Now, if you do get some feedback, it's really important that you act on it and that you show that you've acted on it, especially if you've got somebody who is going to dive with you again and again, quite common in BSAC, such that they can see that you've acted on the feedback. For example, if you've got something missing from the brief, or someone says there was something missing from the brief, then in future briefs that they're going to see, you can obviously incorporate it. Now, if you're going to give somebody feedback, maybe a day or so after a dive that you thought about, and you send it via email, then make sure if you're receiving the email as the dive leader or whatever, that you actually just take the time to reply and say, thank you very much for the feedback. You can go into more detail if you like, but ultimately just that quick reply to say, thank you, I've received it, I'll take it forward. Then it just closes that communication loop. It's a real pet hate of mine where I've sent various dive companies a bit of feedback saying I thought this could have been done a bit better, wasn't really too happy about that, whatever, and you never get any response, and it's just like, come on, and it just stops people giving feedback in the future, and the whole thing breaks down. That's how we get better, by giving each other feedback. Okay, so almost there. In summary, it all goes back to that base principle of making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. Think about the bow tie model of ways to stop things going wrong, but then when things do go wrong, what you can do as a dive leader to mitigate things getting any worse. Whether you're planning a new dive site, whether it's the same site you've done before, you're actually doing a dive or you're debriefing a dive afterwards, remember to look at the conditions. Don't just look at the errors. Look at what made it more likely for things to go wrong. Was there enough time to do all the right checks? Did you put effort in, or could you put more effort into more junior divers to get them, more involved, more comfortable with what's going on? If you go for a dive, something goes wrong, and you have to do a real life rescue, then don't be surprised if things go badly if you haven't done your rescue training beforehand. Nobody has all the answers in diving. It's really important to maintain that curious attitude. You're never going to stop learning. Ask why people do things a certain way. Everyone's got different points of view. Loads of other people out there to learn from. Social media, books, magazines, podcasts. Keep doing courses as well to expand your technical skills as you go. Right, validate critical assumptions. It's humans function as quickly as we can because we make assumptions all the time. And an awful lot of the time, probably in the order of 99%, those assumptions are valid. But when it comes to critical things, it's really important to make sure those assumptions are actually valid. So assuming your gas is turned on when you're doing a negative entry is probably not a good idea. Communication is good. Communication is a bit of an art form, and for me, it's that glue that brings everything together. So certainly when you're doing a brief, engage your audience as much as you can with some two-way communication. Get them involved with it as well. It keeps them motivated and makes the whole thing more rewarding, and it allows you to understand them as well as them understanding you. Set the example. Okay, so do your best when you're demonstrating technical skills, when you're going through briefings, when you're doing checks. Engage with your team. Smile when you're talking to them. Maintain eye contact. Be enthusiastic, but make sure you demonstrate humility. Admit your mistakes. Nobody's perfect. We generally all enjoy diving, so show that you're enjoying your diving. That's it's critical that we all have fun out of it. That's why we're here. Be the dive leader that you want to follow.